I'd like to get a little deeper into qualitative research now and talk a little bit about grounded theory. So grounded theory first became known through some results of a grounded theory study, a book that was published in 1965 called Awareness of Dying. This is an influential study of nurses and dying patients. And then the authors published their method in a book called Discovery of Grounded Theory, published in 1967. And then the authors split up and led two competing schools of thought over whether reducing the ideas to a repeatable method would destroy the creativity and open-mindedness necessary for the process. So one of them said that it would, and one said that it wouldn't. These two authors, by the way, were sociologists, Glaser and Strauss, Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss. And they elevated qualitative research to respectability with these two books. Previously, people didn't, quantitative scientists didn't take qualitative research seriously. And the term grounded theory means grounded in data. And you can see its influence in contextual inquiry. So you've probably done contextual inquiry by the time that you're seeing this slideshow, and so you're probably familiar with contextual inquiry. So let me do a little sidebar on contextual inquiry if you haven't, or if you have. So contextual inquiry works from notes, and in contextual inquiry you distill notes in layers, and in contextual inquiry you reduce the number of labels by layer. And in contextual inquiry, you stop when the material is exhausted. Contextual inquiry uses small index card-like notes, post-it notes. And you rework the layers in contextual inquiry. And you don't do a video of the interviews, or at least the originators of contextual inquiry recommend that you don't. And they also recommend that you don't talk about contextual inquiry between interview and interpretation. That sounds suspiciously like the first rule of Fight Club. But these are all things that can be said of grounded theory. All the things that I've just said about contextual inquiry apply to grounded theory. So it's possible to see in contextual inquiry these elements of grounded theory, and possible that the originators of contextual inquiry, which is much more recent than grounded theory, were influenced by the originators of grounded theory. So anyway, back to grounded theory. So grounded theory starts with theoretical sampling. So that brings up the question, what the heck is theoretical sampling? And theoretical sampling is that you choose the next data point. We would call it data point among information scientists. Sociologists call them datum, as the singular of data. And we choose the next one on the basis of the current state of theory. And so what is one data point? One data point is an observation or interview. And we continue with a constant comparative method. And this is joined with theoretical sampling. So there's joint coding and analysis. We're not coding first, and we're not exploiting data for theoretical categories first. We're doing both of these things together. And this is useful for generating theory, not for testing theory. And that's something that's mentioned in the book Discovery of Grounded Theory on page 105. So step one of grounded theory is constant comparative coding, and I'll say a lot about that. I'll say much less about the other stages. So in constant comparative coding, we make field notes, and we code field notes, and we code them at different levels of generality. And I should mention that coding to the sociologists means the same thing that labeling would to us, or tagging would to us. So every place where I say code, you could think of the word label or the word tag, and every place that I say coding, you could think of it as tagging or labeling. So coding is the association of an incident in the field notes with a category of analysis. And the examples that I'm going to give you are from the book Awareness of Dying. So a category example, this is a code, is social loss. So in the field notes that Glaser and Strauss recorded, they said things like, the nurse says he was so young, or the nurse says he was to be a doctor, or the nurse says she had a full life, or the nurse says, what will her husband and children do without her? So all of those statements that the nurse made or questions that the nurse asked were coded as social loss in the field notes. So you may mark up the field notes with categories, or what was very popular among sociologists was to mark the categories on index cards and use the index cards for sorting purposes later. Now there is software, there's contemporary software like NVivo and MaxQDA that have multiple panels and color coding and various other features. They all go under the category of QDAS, that's QDAS, Qualitative Data Analysis Systems. And there are a bunch of them, and for the most part they're very expensive and they don't work that well. So for example, I'm doing a grounded theory study right now in which I'm not using any software package, although that kind of bugs me. I kind of would like to be using a software package even though they aren't that good. But one of my collaborators doesn't want to use any software, and I can totally understand that because a lot of the things that she does are not easily reproducible in software. Okay, so the defining rule of constant comparative coding is that while coding, we compare with previous incidents in the same category. And there could literally be thousands of pages of field notes. And constant comparison generates theoretical properties of a category. So the types of category, conditions favoring and disfavoring the category, and the consequences of the category, and the relationship of the category to other categories. So those are all theoretical properties of the category. So an example of a theoretical property would be that patient care varies positively with social loss. So the nurses care more for the patients who they perceive as the fact that they're dying is incurring a greater social loss. Some other properties are some social attributes are seen immediately and others take time. And nurses combine these attributes to calculate social loss. So the immediate things are age, ethnic group, and social class, and the things that take time are occupational worth, marital status, and education. And they're not in any sense, the sociologists who are studying them are not in any sense judging the nurses for this. They're simply recording what they see the nurses doing and trying to explain it. So there are two kinds of categories, and I hate to say that there are categories of categories, but that's the way it is. So categories label incidents. And the first kind of category is constructed by the analyst. That is, for an example of social loss. Social loss is an example of that category. It's constructed by the analyst. The second category is abstracted from the research situation. For example, composure would be an example of that. So the nurse stated, I feared losing composure when the family cried over the child. So the composure is a behavior that's abstracted from the research situation. So the first category is something that the analyst tends to construct explanations. So social loss is an explanation of how the nurse feels. The second category, the research situation, tends to give rise to process or behavior codes or labels. And composure is an example of behavior. So the relationship between two categories could be exemplified by the calculation of social loss affects composure. So that's the relationship of two different categories or two different codes, two different labels. And some examples of the latter category would include justice, becoming, stigma, consultation, and consolation. So those are all examples of processes or behaviors that emerge abstracted from the research situation. Now, after you code for one category 3 or 4 times, you'll start to notice conflicts. So this brings us to the second rule of grounded theory, which is you should stop coding and record a memo on the ideas about the conflicts. And that memo serves 2 purposes. And the first purpose is to tap into the freshness of theoretical notions, because you're right in the middle of thinking about it, so it's a good time to write about it right then. And the second is that it relieves conflicts in thinking. So it's hard for you to continue when you have cognitive dissonance going on. So the memo should take some time, and they don't specify, of course, how much time, but they potentially take a long time. And they're seeking grounded conclusions, and by grounded conclusions we mean conclusions that are grounded in the data. So you could spend hours on one page or do 20 pages in half an hour. And this is a striking contrast to pre-designed research. In quantitative research, there should be controls on the time that you spend. And in qualitative research, there is not. So you may leave room on field notes for memos. And this practice actually has kind of a strange purpose, which is following here. It may help to restrict the use of incident as illustration to one memo. So the idea is that it forces the analyst to use the incident to illustrate its most important properties or categories, and overcomes the tendency to reuse the same incident over and over for different purposes. Obviously, this assumes that you're using paper notebooks and just leaving a little bit of space in the paper notebook to do some illustration. There could be an analogous thing electronically, I suppose, but I don't know of any electronic tools that incorporate this idea. Okay, so up until now we've just been on step 1 of 4 steps, which is the constant comparative coding step. So now let's talk about the other 3 steps. So step 2 is integrating categories and their properties. So constant comparative units change over time, and they start out as comparing one incident to another incident, but increasingly you start comparing an incident to a category. So an example of the transition is when the nurses recalculate social loss as they learn about patients. From then on, once the researchers notice this, they compared each calculation incident with the knowledge about calculation instead of comparing the incidents to each other. So they learned that age was the most important characteristic in calculating social loss, and then they used that to see how age affected other variables. For example, education turned out to be the most important in middle-aged patients, much less important in the very young or very old patients. Modifications become fewer as comparisons are made, so theory becomes integrated by comparisons of incidents to categories. Okay, then step 3 is delimiting the theory, and that consists of delimiting the theory and categories. So you have fewer and fewer major modifications as time goes on in this stage. And you clarify the logic instead of making more drastic modification. And you start to omit relevant properties. So the theme of this stage is reduction. And by reduction, I mean reduction to a smaller set of concepts. And that set of concepts are the highest level concepts. And the concepts become more general. And this leads to parsimony of variables and parsimony of formulation and wider scope, that is, wider applicability of the theory to a wider range of situations. It also leads to a reduction in the list of categories. So eventually you reach something called theoretical saturation, and this happens when new incidents are less and less likely to yield new categories. The list of categories is saturated when new incidents don't need new categories. So for example, after age became the baseline for calculating social loss, many new incidents referring to age didn't need to be coded. And theoretical saturation can be a strategy. So, for example, don't recode previously coded pages unless needed. When a new category emerges, code only from then on. If the category becomes theoretically saturated in the new material, then there's no need to go back and revisit the material before the category emerged. And time saving is important in this because it is a very time-consuming process. Unrecorded recollection. So this occurs when the analyst recollects something observed or heard connected to the current category, and theoretical saturation should be the guide as to whether or not a memo should describe the incident. Okay, and then finally we move on to step 4, writing of the theory. So at this point the analyst possesses coded data, a series of memos, and theory. So you collate the memos, you return to the coded data as needed, and you just write your theory. So the conclusion is that the theory can be grounded. This is kind of a long conclusion, I'm afraid. The theory can be grounded in data. The theory is developmental. The method is inductive. The theory may be discussional or propositional. Later work in grounded theory uses some terms that I want to introduce to you. So the later work in grounded theory uses the terms open coding, axial coding, and selective coding. So I just want to introduce what those terms mean. Open coding refers to coding incidents. Axial coding refers to coding relationships between categories. And selective coding refers to revisiting the coded data. So let me finish by asking why you would want to do grounded theory or why not. And this comes from a book on HCI by Jonathan Lazar and others, written in 2017 and available, I think, on my courses or in the library. Grounded theory is easy. At least it's easy enough that novices have done it. So this is in contrast to a lot of quantitative research where you need at least a couple of semesters of statistics before you're ready to start. It generates theory, and people often believe the results that you get from grounded theory because they explain difficult phenomena that you wouldn't be able to explain any other way. And people like it because there's an interplay between data and analysis. The process starts with both data and analysis, so there's an immediacy to it. It's engaging to the researcher on all levels right away. So why might you not do grounded theory? Well, coding can be overwhelming. It is a long and in some ways tedious and just very difficult job, coding. I said it's easy, but it's easy in the sense that you don't need training to do it, but it's difficult in the sense that you need really strong powers of concentration and a really good memory to do it. Okay, another reason that you might not want to use grounded theory is there's no method for evaluating theories. Grounded theory is just a method for generating theories, not for evaluating whether this or that theory is good. And we'll talk more about that later. And finally, it is subject to bias on the part of the researcher. It's not easy to be open-minded, which is a prerequisite for this approach. And indeed, one of the founders of grounded theory thinks that it's difficult to be open-minded if you reduce this to a prescribed method, a repeatable approach. Okay, and that's the end of what I want to say. This is just touching the surface of grounded theory, like all of these lectures. I invite you to read more to find out some more insights into it. And in particular, with grounded theory, a lot of people believe you only really get it um, by doing it. That reading about it tends to be inconclusive. So applying grounded theory is an exciting and challenging thing that you can do. All right, thanks for your attention. Bye.